I thought it was just a dream, a nightmare I'd wake up from. But the sound slow, steady, like a pulse never stopped. After Valentine's night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something followed me home. And it wasn't human. I thought it was just a fleeting sound, something my overactive imagination cooked up after an exhausting Valentine's Day. But as the night wore on, the soft, rhythmic pulse continued. It was faint at first, just barely audible over the hum of my refrigerator. But as the hours passed, it became impossible to ignore. The steady thump, thump, thump echoed through my apartment. I convinced myself it was just the pipes, the house settling, or maybe my heart trying to catch up after a long evening. But no matter how hard I tried to dismiss it, the sound only grew louder. I had met him a few hours earlier, at a quiet, dimly lit restaurant. His name was Eric. He was charming, confident, and easy to talk to. We spent the night laughing, exchanging stories, making small talk about things we'd never share with anyone else. I felt something real between us, a connection that was undeniable. As the evening came to a close, he walked me back to my apartment, kissed me gently on the cheek, and wished me a good night. It was the perfect end to a perfect date, or so I thought. I remember the moment I stepped into my apartment, feeling that rush of comfort and peace you get when you're finally alone. But then, as I locked the door and tossed my keys onto the counter, I heard it. Thump, thump, thump. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. I listened closely. It sounded like a heartbeat, slow and steady. It didn't make sense. I was alone. I checked the living room, the kitchen, the bathroom. Nothing. No one. Just the pipes, I whispered to myself. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. The sound persisted, as if taunting me, following me wherever I went. It seemed to come from the walls, the floorboards, the ceiling. I paced around the apartment, trying to track it down, but it was everywhere. Every corner I turned, every room I checked, it was always there, just beneath the surface. Thump, thump, thump. I tried to distract myself. I sat down on the couch, turned on the television, but the heartbeat never stopped. It was like it was inside my head, echoing louder each passing minute. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my phone and dialed Eric's number. It rang once, twice, 3 times before his voicemail picked up. I hung up, wanting to appear crazy. What was I supposed to say anyway? Hey, I'm hearing a heartbeat, and I think it might be your fault. I tried to calm myself. Maybe I was just tired. Maybe the date had left me more on edge than I realized. I decided to take a shower, hoping it would clear my head. But as I stood under the hot water, I could still hear it. Thump, thump, thump. The sound grew louder, more insistent. I rushed through the shower, desperate to escape the noise, but it followed me, ever present, like a shadow I couldn't outrun. I sat down on the edge of the bathtub, my hands shaking. Happening? Was I losing my mind? I decided to check my phone again. Maybe it was a message from Eric, something that would distract me, help me make sense of what was going on. But there was nothing, no texts, no calls, only the steady, haunting pulse of the heartbeat. I glanced toward the bedroom. That was where it seemed to be the loudest, as if it were coming from the walls, the very foundation of the room itself. I hesitated but then stood up, compelled to investigate. The room felt colder than usual, a chill running through the air that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I crept over to the bed, my heart pounding in my chest, and sat down on the edge. It was then I noticed something strange, a faint, red glow beneath the bed. My mind raced with possibilities, each one worse than the last. Was someone under there? Was I just imagining things? Slowly, I bent down and peered into the darkness. Nothing, but the heartbeat. It hadn't stopped. It was louder now, clearer, as if it were right beneath me. I pulled the blankets away from the bed, my hands trembling, and got down on all fours, looking beneath the bed. Nothing, but the sound. It was there. It was coming from inside the walls. I stood up, feeling lightheaded. Panic set in as I rushed out of the room and back into the living room. The heartbeat was still there, still echoing, but now it felt like it was coming from all around me, surrounding me. I had to get out of here. I needed to find out what was happening. I grabbed my jacket and rushed out the door, barely remembering to lock it behind me. The cold air hit my face as I stepped into the hallway. I didn't know where I was going, but I couldn't stay in that apartment any longer. The walls felt like they were closing in, and the heartbeat at it wouldn't stop. It was maddening. I stood there in the hallway for what felt like an eternity, trying to collect myself. I checked my phone again. Still no messages from Eric. And then, just as I was about to step back inside, I saw it. At the end of the hallway, the door to the apartment next to mine was cracked open. A dim light flickered from within, casting strange shadows across the floor. The heartbeat, the relentless pulse seemed to be coming from that direction. My heart pounded in my chest as I approached the door. Something drew me in. An invisible force. A need to understand what was happening. I hesitated for a moment, my breath shallow, before pushing the door open. The apartment was empty. The air felt stale, as if it hadn't been lived in for years. The walls were covered in peeling wallpaper, and the furniture was old and faded. But the heartbeat now that I was inside it was deafening. I looked around frantically. The sound was coming from behind a closed door at the far end of the apartment. I approached it cautiously, my heart racing. What could be on the other side? Who was living here? Why had I never noticed this apartment before? I reached for the doorknob. It was cold to the touch. I turned it slowly, my hand shaking, and pushed the door open. Behind the door was a small room, dimly lit by a single, flickering light bulb. The walls were covered in strange symbols, drawn in what looked like blood, and in the center of the room, sitting on the floor, was an old, rusted, heart-shaped box. The heartbeat. It was coming from the box. My breath caught in my throat. I took a step forward, reaching out to touch the box. The moment my fingers brushed the surface, the heartbeat stopped. I pulled my hand back quickly, my pulse racing. What was going on? What had I just uncovered? But as I stepped away, I heard something else. A soft, whispered voice, almost imperceptible, but clear enough to make my blood run cold. "Welcome back." I spun around, but there was no one there. I stumbled backward, my mind racing. How was this possible? Who had left this box here? And why had I been drawn to it? The heartbeat had stopped, but the sense of dread it left in its wake was overwhelming. I rushed out of the apartment, slamming the door behind me, and ran back to my own place. The heartbeat, once so loud and constant, was gone, but I knew, deep down, that it wasn't over. I couldn't escape it. It was still with me, waiting, lurking in the shadows. And Eric? I never saw him again. The heartbeat, that relentless pulse, had stopped, but the fear didn't leave me. It lingered in the pit of my stomach, a gnawing sensation that I couldn't shake. I couldn't escape the feeling that something was still with me. The walls of my apartment, which had once felt like a sanctuary, now felt suffocating, as if they were closing in on me. The air was with a sense of impending doom. I had seen something, the box, the symbols, the whispering voice, but what did it mean? And more importantly, why did I feel like I wasn't alone? I hadn't slept much the night before. When I finally closed my eyes, I was plagued by the image of Eric, the man I had met on Valentine's night. His warm smile, his charm, his confidence, everything about him had seemed perfect. But now, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. His face lingered in my mind, his words echoing in my thoughts. "Welcome back." That's what I heard when I touched the heart-shaped box. Those words sent a chill down my spine that hadn't faded, no matter how much I tried to distract myself. The next morning I woke with a heavy heart. The pulse was gone, but it had left something else behind, an overwhelming sense of unease. I couldn't just go on with my life, as if nothing had happened. I had to know what was going on, who Eric really was, and why his presence felt so wrong. I grabbed my phone and searched for his name. At first, I didn't expect much. A quick glance through social media profiles, a few common details. But what I found shocked me. Eric was a ghost. Not in the literal sense, not like a translucent apparition, but in the sense that he had no past. There were no social media profiles from years ago, no photos from childhood, no friends from high school. It was as if he had appeared out of nowhere. I dug deeper, scrolling through news archives, trying to find anything that could connect him to something, anything that could explain the strange events of the night. That's when I found it. An article from 20 years ago. A tragedy in a small town just outside the city, an entire family killed in a mysterious fire. Their house burned to the ground with no survivors. Investigators are baffled as no cause of ignition has been found. Witnesses claim to have seen strange shadows moving around the property before the flames engulfed the house. I stared at the article for what felt like hours. It was a small story barely making the news, and yet it sent a shiver down my spine. The family that died in the fire had the same last name as Eric's. Could this be a coincidence? I spent the rest of the day poring over the article, reading everything I could find about the tragedy. There was something off about it. The timing of the fire, the strange shadows that witnesses had seen, and the eerie, unexplainable circumstances of their deaths. It all felt too familiar, too connected to what I had just experienced. That night, the heartbeat returned. At first, it was soft, almost like a whisper beneath the surface of the silence. But soon, it became more pronounced, more insistent. Thump, thump. I sat up in bed, my heart racing. I had to figure this out. I couldn't just ignore it anymore. I needed answers. I grabbed my jacket and rushed out the door, making my way to the address listed in the article. It was a small house on the outskirts of the city, far enough away to feel isolated, but close enough that it didn't seem completely out of reach. As I approached the area, I felt the pulse of the heartbeat grow stronger. It was as if the very ground beneath my feet was alive with it, vibrating with a rhythm that was impossible to ignore. The house was in ruins. All that remained were the charred remains of what once had been their home. The fire had destroyed everything, every trace of the family who had lived there. There were no surviving pieces, no signs that anyone had ever called this place home, just ash and burned wood. I stepped closer, my breath shallow, my mind racing. The heartbeat was louder now, reverberating in my chest, in my head. I couldn't explain it, but I knew the source was somewhere here, somewhere hidden beneath the rubble. I walked around the perimeter of the house, carefully picking my way through the debris. Then, something caught my eye, something I hadn't noticed before. A small half-burned book was wedged between two large pieces of charred wood. I pulled it out, my hands trembling as I opened it. The pages were singed, the ink smudged, but I could still make out some of the words. The necklace in my hand trembled, almost like it was alive. It was warm now, impossibly warm, like the pulse of a living thing. I could feel it, the heartbeat, the rhythm of it syncing with my own. My breath caught in my throat, and for the first time, I truly understood that the necklace wasn't just a piece of jewelry. It was something far darker, far more sinister. It had a power I couldn't comprehend. "What are you?" I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. He tilted his head slightly, studying me, and for a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of something human deep in his eyes. But it was gone in an instant, replaced by the same empty darkness that had taken over him. He was no longer human. He wasn't even a ghost. He was something else. "What I am," he said slowly, "is someone who has been betrayed, someone who has been forgotten. And now, I'm here to make sure you never forget again." I wanted to run, to hide, but my legs felt like lead. I was frozen in place, unable to move, unable to think. The power of his presence was overwhelming, suffocating. I couldn't breathe. My thoughts were a tangled mess, a jumble of confusion and disbelief. He reached out, his fingers brushing lightly against my cheek. The coldness of his touch made me shudder, but I couldn't pull away. It was as if my body no longer belonged to me, as if I had been swallowed by the darkness that surrounded him. "I gave you everything," he whispered, "and you threw it all away." Tears pricked at the corners of my eyes. "I didn't want this," I choked out. "I didn't want you to die." I didn't want to be left alone. His hand tightened around mine, and I could feel the pulse of the necklace, now vibrating under my skin. His grip was like iron, cold and unyielding. I looked down at it, the engraving glowing faintly in the dim light. "I never left," he repeated, his voice more insistent now, "and I won't ever leave." I felt a surge of panic, the overwhelming fear that if I didn't get away, if I didn't escape this nightmare, I would be lost to him forever. But when I tried to move, my body wouldn't respond. I was trapped in his grasp, held in place by something far stronger than any physical force. "Let go of me," I begged, my voice breaking, but he didn't respond. Instead, he pulled me closer, his face inches from mine. His breath was cold, and I could feel the heat from the necklace searing into my skin. It was as if it was marking me, claiming me, and no matter how much I tried to fight it, I couldn't escape. "You'll never escape me," he whispered. "You're mine now. We're bound together. Forever." The room spun, and I felt the weight of his words crash down on me. There was no way out. No way to break the chain that held me to him. I had thought I could escape the past, but now I knew the truth. The past was never gone. It was always there, lurking, waiting for the right moment to reclaim me. The necklace tightened around my neck, its cold grip suffocating. I gasped for air, my fingers clawing at it, but it wouldn't come off. It was like a part of me now, just like him, a part of the nightmare I couldn't escape. "You're mine," he repeated, his voice a low, guttural sound. "And you will never forget me." At that moment, I realized the truth. I hadn't been running from him. I hadn't been trying to escape the past. I had been running from myself, from the part of me that still loved him, still yearned for him. That part of me was still here, buried deep inside, and he had found it. He had brought it to the surface. The room was spinning now, the edges of my vision blurring as the weight of it all pressed down on me. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. I couldn't do anything except stand there, consumed by the realization that he was never going to let me go. "Forever," he whispered one last time, and in that moment, I knew he was right. We were bound. Forever. "Are you running away from it?" he asked, his tone smooth and eerily calm. "You can't escape, you know." I felt a cold chill run down my spine as I stared into the darkness around me. The streetlights flickered, casting long shadows that danced on the pavement. "What do you want from me?" I demanded, my voice shaking with fear and frustration. "Why are you doing this to me? What is this? This curse?" Eric's laugh echoed in my ear, a hollow sound that sent shivers through my body. "You don't understand, do you? It's not just a curse. It's love. It's the love of those who have been lost, those who have been forgotten. It's a love that never dies. And it's your turn to keep that love alive." I clutched the phone tighter, my knuckles white. "You want me to kill someone, don't you?" The line went silent for a moment, and I could hear Eric's breath on the other end. When he spoke again, his voice was low and urgent. "Not just anyone. The one you love." I recoiled, my stomach twisting in knots. It felt like my entire world was falling apart. "I don't understand. I know you don't, but you will. You always do," Eric whispered, his voice now tinged with something darker. "The cycle must continue. It's the price of love." I felt sick to my stomach, the weight of his words pressing down on me. The heartbeat pulsed louder in my ears, as if it were syncing with the fear that rose in my chest. Before I could respond, the line went dead. I stared at the screen in disbelief, my mind racing. The curse had tied me to Eric, to this endless cycle of pain and sacrifice. And now, it was my turn to choose. My own life, or someone else's. But who? Who could I sacrifice? And who would choose me? I didn't know how long I stood there in the street, caught between a terrifying decision and the darkness that surrounded me. It felt like time had frozen, and yet the heartbeat continued, ever present, echoing in the silence. I needed answers. I needed to know how to break this cycle before it consumed me completely. That's when I remembered the book, the old singed pages with the cryptic message about the ritual. It had said something about a choice, something about ending the curse. but I hadn't understood it at the time. But now it was all making sense. The sacrifice, the love, heartbeat at it was all connected. The cycle couldn't end unless I made the ultimate choice. I pulled the book from my bag and flipped through the pages, the faint scent of burning paper still lingering in the air. The words were blurry in some places, but one passage stood out. The heart of the one who loves must be offered in sacrifice. Only then will the pulse cease and the curse be broken. But beware, for the one chosen will never be free. The heartbeat will live on in their soul, an eternal reminder of the love that was lost. I read it over and over again, trying to make sense of the cryptic message. The heart of the one who loves. Was I the one who had to die? Or was it someone else? Someone close to me? The thought sent a chill through my body. My mind raced, my heart pounding. The decision was clear. I had to stop the curse. But the cost was too high. I stood in the street, clutching the book, my mind reeling. Eric's words echoed in my head, his pride, voice like a ghost, lingering even after the call had ended. He was right. I couldn't escape. Not now. Not ever. The curse had already taken root. It was only a matter of time before it consumed me. I needed to confront him. I needed to face whatever this was. The love, the curse, heartbeat at it had all led me here. To this moment, to this choice. Without thinking, I turned and headed toward the last place I ever wanted to be. The burned house. The place where everything had started. The place where the cycle began. As I neared the ruins, the heartbeat grew louder, its rhythmic pounding vibrating through the air. It was as if the very ground beneath my feet was pulsing with it. I felt the weight of it, suffocating me, drawing me closer to the center of the curse. I stepped into the charred remains of the house, the air thick with the scent of smoke and decay. The shadows clung to the walls, stretching and twisting like creatures from some ancient nightmare. And there, in the center of the room, was Eric. He was standing by the remains of the old heart-shaped box, his back turned toward me. But as I approached, he slowly turned around, his eyes gleaming with something dark, something ancient. "You've come," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. But I could hear the satisfaction in it. "I knew you would. It's always been your choice. After all, what do you want from me?" I spat, my fear transforming into rage. "I've been running from this curse long enough. I'm done being your pawn." Eric smiled, a cold, calculating smile that made my blood run cold. "You're not running anymore. You've come to accept it. You've come to understand that the curse is yours. And now, you must make your choice. Your love or your life." I trembled, but I refused to let him see it. I was done. I was done with the fear, the uncertainty, the heartbeat. I stepped forward, my voice steady. "I choose to end it." Eric's eyes darkened, and for a moment, I thought I saw something like regret flash across his darkened face. But then, the heartbeat stopped. Silence. An eerie, hollow silence. And then, the ground beneath my feet cracked open. A blinding light enveloped the room, and I felt my body being pulled into the light, into the very heart of the curse. The air was thick, suffocating, as if the walls of the world were closing in around me. But before I could react, I saw it, the final sacrifice. It wasn't mine. It was Eric's. And just like that, the heartbeat faded into nothingness. But as I walked away from the ruins, my heart heavy with the cost of the choice, I knew the curse hadn't truly been broken. The heartbeat might have stopped, but its echo would live on forever. The ruins of the house still smoldered behind me, and the fading echoes of that final sacrifice were replaced by an overwhelming silence. The heartbeat had stopped, or so I thought. In that moment of calm, I allowed myself to believe it was finally over. But something inside me told me that it was only the beginning. I walked through the dark streets, my body numb, my mind racing. Eric's sacrifice, the way he'd given himself up to the curse to end it, had left me with questions. And now I was more confused than ever. If the curse had been tied to him, if he'd become the heartbeat, why was I still hearing it? I hadn't expected to feel it. The weight of the heartbeat that had haunted me for so long had been there, ever present, like a shadow I couldn't escape. But now, even after everything, it was still there, thumping, louder than ever before, almost as if it was inside me. The air grew cold, sharper, and I could feel the tendrils of fear starting to coil around me again. Looked over my shoulder, expecting to see the dark silhouette of the house, but it was gone. Only the faint outline of the streetlights remained in the distance. Still, the heartbeat pulsed. Within me, I wasn't alone. Not really. I hurried back to my apartment, pushing open the door with a force that almost made it slam. Pulse was erratic, but that was nothing compared to the rhythm I could feel deep inside me. It was my heartbeat number. It wasn't mine. It was too slow, too deep, like the sound of something, ancient and primal. The faint rhythmic thumping echoed throughout my apartment, bouncing off the walls like an ever intruder in my own mind. I had to get away from it. I couldn't let it consume me like it had done with Eric. But no matter how far I went, no matter how tightly I pressed my hands against my ears, it wouldn't stop. I couldn't ignore it any longer. I fell into the old armchair by the window, my hands shaking as I tried to steady my breathing. The house was silent now, but the heartbeat, it was still there. It had become a part of me. I gripped the edges of the chair, feeling the sweat form on my palms. What had I missed? How had this curse really worked? Eric had sacrificed himself for me, but did that mean it had just shifted to me? Was that the curse's price in eternal, unrelenting heartbeat that would never cease? I had to know. I stood up, my legs weak, but determination forcing me forward. The journal. I had to find the journal again. I had missed something. I was sure of it. It wasn't just some cryptic warning, it was a guide, a manual. I rushed into my bedroom, the pulse pounding louder now, pushing my thoughts to the brink of madness. There it was, still lying on the desk, its pages worn and frayed from handling. I grabbed it, flipping it open without hesitation. My fingers trembled as I searched the pages, each one revealing bits of information I had overlooked before. There were references to a ritual more than just a curse, but a tether, a link between the souls of those involved. It was not just about sacrifice, it was about connection. The heartbeat was the sound of a soul bound to another, kept alive through a force beyond the physical world. As I read, my stomach twisted in knots. This wasn't just about Eric, it was about me, about us. The journal described how the ritual tied two people together, in a bond that transcended death. When one soul died, the other was forever linked to the pulse of that departed soul. No matter how far apart they were, no matter how much time passed, the heartbeats would always remain connected. And that's when I realized it wasn't Eric who was still bound to me, it was someone else. The journal's final pages were a chilling revelation. The heartbeat didn't just symbolize the connection between two people. It was a warning, a message from beyond the grave. I closed the book with a heavy heart, the realization weighing down on me like a rock in my chest. My date from that fateful Valentine's night, the one I'd thought had disappeared, wasn't gone at all. He was the one still tied to me. His soul, bound to the curse, was what fed the heartbeat. The love I thought I had left behind had only grown stronger. And now, it wasn't just his presence I felt. It was his hunger. The heartbeat pulsed louder now, no longer just a sound but a living force, thumping in my chest, in my skull, in every inch of my skin. It felt like something was inside of me, crawling beneath my flesh, demanding my attention. I stood, hands pressed to my temples, as the beat intensified, drowning out all other thoughts. It wasn't just a rhythm anymore. It was a voice, a presence, a force. "Help me," the whisper came, faint but unmistakable. I froze. The voice was his, my date's voice. "Please," he pleaded. "I can't escape it. You have to help me." I felt my legs give out beneath me, and I sank to the floor, struggling to breathe. It was all coming at me too fast. How could I have been so blind? The journal hadn't just been a blind warning, it was a cry for help. The heartbeat began to change, taking on an angry tone, faster, harder. It was like a drum, pounding in my ears, each thump sending sharp pangs through my body. The room grew darker, and I realized I wasn't alone. Shadows moved at the edges of my vision, flickering and stretching unnaturally. It wasn't just the heartbeat that was feeding on my fear anymore. The curse had begun to manifest my date's spirit. His soul was starting to break free. The pulse quickened, and the shadows moved closer, circling me. The air grew thick with an oppressive energy. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. Please. The voice came again, but now it was closer, colder. Don't leave me. The shadows solidified, forming a figure before me. I tried to scream, but the sound was strangled in my throat. The figure stepped into the dim light, and I saw him date. His face was twisted, not in anger, but in pain. His eyes were hollow, his skin gray and gaunt, as though life had been drained from him. But there was something more, something I hadn't noticed. Before the heartbeat was coming from him, inside of him. His chest was moving, but it wasn't his heart that was beating. It was mine. You're not free, I whispered, barely able to comprehend the sight before me. The figure reached out, his fingers twitching like they wanted to grasp my soul. I never was, he rasped, his voice barely audible over the pounding pulse. And now, neither are you. I recoiled in horror as his hand brushed against my skin. The warmth of his touch was unnerving. I could feel it. The link between us. It was no longer just a sound, it was a presence, living and breathing within us both. At that moment, I knew what I had to do. The cycle wasn't over. Eric's sacrifice had been in vain. The curse had simply shifted. The ritual hadn't been about ending the heartbeat at it. Was about learning to live with it, to become one with it. The only way to stop it would be to sever the bond. But that would mean I would have to let go of him. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath. The heartbeat echoed in my chest, louder than ever before. I reached out, trembling, and placed my hand over his chest, feeling the pulse that wasn't mine. I'm sorry, I whispered. And then, with all the strength I had left, I pulled the cord that connected us. The pulse stopped. For a moment, the silence was deafening. Then, as the shadows dissolved, I was left alone in the dark, the faintest trace of a heartbeat still reverberating through my soul. And I knew, no matter how hard I tried, I could never escape the pulse within. The silence that followed the heartbeats was not the relief I had expected. The heavy rhythm that had plagued my every waking moment seemed to vanish, only to leave an emptiness. Felt like the aftermath of an explosion. I stood in the center of my room, trembling. The presence the weight had finally lifted. But there was no joy, no sense of freedom. Instead, all I felt was an eerie, soul-deep loneliness. The cold, relentless connection between me and the spirit of my late date had been severed. Or so I thought. But as the hours dragged on, I began to question that belief. The heartbeat, now faint but insistent, began to echo through the very marrow of my bones. It wasn't the same powerful, consuming pulse that had nearly driven me mad. It was quieter, softer, almost patient, as if it were waiting for me to acknowledge it. I couldn't ignore it any longer. The journal, the one I had clung to in desperation during the darkest moments, still sat open on my desk. My hands shook as I flipped through its pages again, seeking any hidden detail I might have missed. Every word, every warning, had felt like a lifeline, but nothing had prepared me for the truth I was about to uncover. My fingers brushed over the final entry, a passage so faint and cryptic that I hadn't fully understood its significance before. It spoke of a curse tied not just to person, but to the very concept of love itself. The bond was deeper, darker than anything I had imagined. When two souls connected in such an intense, almost unnatural way, the tether formed was not easily broken. No, not broken. The tether could be reinforced. The realization hit me like a tidal wave. The heartbeat, the presence, it wasn't a curse that was trying to destroy me. It was a bond that, in its twisted form, had been created by something far greater than I could understand. The spirit, my Valentine's date, wasn't trying to torment me, number. It was trying to reach me, to pull me closer, to keep me tethered. And the more I fought, the stronger the bond became. Panic surged through me. The love we'd shared had been something otherworldly, but I hadn't realized it at the time. I hadn't realized that it was never meant to be a brief connection. It was meant to endure, to transcend the boundaries of life and death. That was the true curse. I staggered back, sinking into the chair as the weight of the truth pressed down on me. I needed to find a way out, a way to break free from this endless love that had no place in the world of the living. But how? The presence returned, subtle at first, just a shiver that crawled down my spine, but it grew, steadily, a cold hand brushing against my neck. The shadows in the corners of the room stretch, reaching. The heartbeat echoed louder now, in perfect synchrony with my own, and it felt as though my heart had begun to beat for two. Was it possible for me to ever escape this? For me to ever escape him? I clutched the journal to my chest, my thoughts racing. Every part of me wanted to reject the truth, to deny what was happening. But deep down, I knew there was no way out. He wasn't just a lost soul anymore. He was part of me, a permanent, inseparable part. And if the bond could not be severed, if it could not be undone, then it would consume me. I stood up abruptly, my heart pounding in my chest. The heartbeat grew louder in response, as if it recognized my defiance. The echoes of his voice, faint as they were, began to seep into my thoughts once again. Don't leave me. It was a whisper at first, then a plea, but there was no comfort in it, no warmth, just desperation. I closed my eyes, breathing in shallow, trembling gasps. He was here, in the room, with me. And no matter where I went, no matter how far I ran, he would always be there, within the depths of my heart. The heartbeat was the tether, the chain that held us together. Please, the voice came again, more insistent this time. I don't want to be alone. I shook my head, my mind reeling. The darkness in the room seemed to swirl with malice, shadows stretching toward me. His presence loomed like an inescapable fog. But at that moment, something unexpected happened. The chill of the room grew colder, the shadows deepened, and the heartbeat seemed to grow faint for a moment. It was as if, the presence was retreating. For a split second, I felt a fleeting sense of peace, but that peace was shattered as the heartbeat suddenly surged, louder, more frantic. It pulsed inside me, rattling my bones, making the very walls of the room feel as though they were closing in. The shadows receded, but a new kind of fear began to rise, something worse than before. It wasn't just the spirit anymore, it was me. I realized then that I had become the tether. It was no longer just my date's soul trying to pull me into the abyss. The bond had done something to me, transformed me into something beyond human. I was no longer just haunted. I was now a part of the curse. I had been irrevocably changed by our connection, and now I was his anchor, his tether, his means of escape from the spirit realm. I fell to my knees, the weight of the realization crashing down on me. Bond could not be broken. Then I had become a vessel for it. There would be no escape for either of us. Not unless I made a choice. I looked around, my mind racing. The room was suffocating, the shadows closing in on me, pressing against my chest. It felt as though the very air itself was being sucked out of the room. The journal lay on the desk, open to the final, hidden passage. The answer had been there all along. The ritual described how the bond between two souls could be severed, but only through a sacrifice. Not just any sacrifice, but a final one. A decision that would force one soul to release the other. And the cost would be life itself. I had to choose. The heartbeat thumped louder, now a chaotic, erratic rhythm. My breath came in shallow gasps, and I could hear the voice growing frantic, more desperate. Don't leave me. Please don't leave me. I can't be alone. I was drowning in the sound, suffocated by it. The curse wasn't just his anymore. It was mine. We were bound flesh and soul. To sever the connection meant destroying one of us. One of us would have to die, and it had to be me. I reached out, trembling, and touched the pages of the journal. The words seemed to blur as my vision swam, the room spinning around me. I whispered the incantation softly, almost in disbelief, but as the words left my mouth, I felt a tremor, in the very fabric of reality. The heartbeat faltered, then ceased altogether. In the stillness that followed, I felt nothing, no voice, no presence, no heartbeat. I had made the choice, and I had let go. But as I stood there, alone in the silence, I realized something even more chilling. The silence wasn't complete. It wasn't peace. It was a lull before the storm, because, even though the heartbeat was gone, the tether remained. I would never be free, and the love that never ended had just begun. The heartbeat forgotten. Final section. The room felt colder than it ever had. It wasn't just the temperature, it was a bone-deep chill, the kind that creeps under your skin and sinks into your soul. The heartbeat had stopped, or at least, I thought it had. But as I stood there, trying to grasp the fragments of reality that were slipping through my fingers, I felt it. The air was thick with an unseen present, something pressing in, suffocating me. The walls seemed to breathe with an eerie rhythm. I stumbled backward, eyes wide with terror, but my feet wouldn't move. My limbs were heavy, as though invisible chains were binding me to the floor. The heartbeat hadn't ceased. It was still here. I could feel it, pulsing in the very air around me. "Leave me alone," I whispered, but the words barely formed, my voice strangled by fear. The photographs on the wall, those strange faces, the ones I'd never seen before, began to shift. The eyes, once faded and lifeless, were now watching me. They glowed, unnatural, menacing, as if they were alive, trapped in time. One by one, the faces began to smile. Not in a friendly way. It was a grimacing, twisted mockery of joy, like they knew something I didn't. Then, it happened. From the corner of my eye, I saw him, the man I had met on that fateful Valentine's night. His figure was blurred at first, like a shadow struggling to manifest, but then he was there, standing in front of me, as real as anyone else. Yet there was something profoundly wrong. His face was pale, his eyes wide and empty, like something had drained him of life. His lips barely moved, but I heard his voice in my head. "You thought it was over?" I couldn't move, couldn't speak. His presence was overwhelming, as if he was suffocating the very air I breathed. His eyes bored into mine, and I knew he wasn't alone. Behind him, shadows shifted. The room darkened, and the heartbeat grew louder, so loud that it rattled my teeth, vibrating through my bones. It was the sound of something ancient, something powerful, clawing its way into the world from beyond the veil. And I realized, with a sickening certainty, that the ritual wasn't over. It had just begun. The symbols on the walls, the strange markings I'd thought were nothing more than coincidence, they glowed, pulsing with an unholy energy. I had triggered something that could never be undone. I had become part of the ritual, and now there was no escape. The heartbeat, that terrifying rhythm, was my tether to whatever dark force had been awakened. "You're part of this now," the man whispered, his voice no longer human. It was a chorus, dozens of voices layered on top of each other, each one filled with desperation and longing. The shadows behind him began to writhe. Figures, blurred and formless, emerged, their faces twisted in agony, their hands reaching out for me, trying to pull me into their world. I could see their skeletal hands stretching toward me, their eyes hollow and filled with an unbearable longing. They weren't just spirits. They were the forgotten, the lost souls of a tragedy, long past, now bound to this place, to this cursed ritual. But it wasn't over. It never would be. The heartbeat was still here, echoing in the depths of my dying chest, and I could feel it growing stronger, louder. It was inside me now, tied to my very soul. I wasn't just hearing it, I was becoming it. I looked at the man. His face was now nothing but a shadow, his features lost in the blackness. His smile was wide, impossible. His eyes gleamed with malice, and I understood then. He had been waiting for me to realize what I had become, what we had become. "The love that never ends," he whispered, his voice now a scream in my mind. It never stops. Not for you, not for anyone. You're mine now. Forever. I felt the room closing in. The shadows crept toward me, cold hands brushing against my skin, pulling me closer to the darkness. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. I was paralyzed by the force, the inevitability of what was happening. I was slipping away. And then, just as everything started to fade into darkness, the heartbeat stopped. For a moment, there was silence. But that silence was worse than the noise. It was the silence of something watching, waiting. I was never meant to escape. And I knew with a horrible certainty that I would never be free. The heartbeat wasn't gone, had become a part of me, just as the curse had become a part of my soul. The room was silent now, but I felt it, the presence, the weight of it pressing down on me. Somewhere, in the distance, I heard the faintest whisper. If you dare, share this story. But remember, every retelling brings it closer to reality. And as I turned to leave, my hand brushed against the wall. The photographs, the ones with the faces, had changed. One of them looked directly at me, eyes wide in horror. And I realized it was me. That was when I knew it would never end. Do you hear it? The heartbeat? It's getting louder. Closer. It's already started with me. Will you be next?